Friends, please check if you're already subscribed to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us. We need to reach 1,000 subscribers to generate income and continue with the channel. Now, let's get to the video. The call came at 6:12 a.m., the kind of hour that feels unfinished, like the world itself hasn't decided whether it wants to wake up or keep pretending nothing is wrong. I remember staring at my phone as it buzzed against the nightstand, the screen lighting up the ceiling in soft blue pulses. I didn't answer at first. Somewhere deep inside me, I already knew that once I picked up, something permanent would happen. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end was calm, too calm. Trained. Professional. They said my aunt's name. Then my uncle's. Then the words car accident. Then silence, waiting for my reaction, like this was a script we'd all rehearsed except me. I didn't cry. Not then. I thanked them. I actually thanked them, as if they'd done me a favor by informing me that the only people who had ever protected me without conditions were gone. After the call ended, I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to my apartment breathe. The hum of the fridge. A car passing outside. Life continuing without asking permission. I pressed my palm against my chest, waiting for something to break loose, but all I felt was weight. Heavy. Settling. They had raised me since I was 14. Not because my parents were dead. No. Because my parents were there, just never present. My aunt and uncle stepped in quietly, legally, and emotionally, without ever making it feel like charity. They never reminded me that they didn't have to. They just did. And now they were gone. The funeral happened 3 days later. My parents showed up late, dressed perfectly, faces carefully arranged into something resembling grief. My mother hugged me like a distant relative. My father squeezed my shoulder and said, "You're being very strong," in a tone that sounded more impressed than concerned. They didn't stay close. They talked to people. Shook hands. Collected sympathy like currency. I stood near the casket alone. I remember thinking how strange it was that death could make a room feel crowded and empty at the same time. After the service, a man in a dark suit approached me. He introduced himself as the executor of the estate. He spoke softly, respectfully, and asked if I could come by his office the following week. My parents noticed immediately. "What's that about?" my mother asked, her voice casual but her eyes sharp. "Legal stuff," I said. "I don't really know." She smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Well, of course. We'll come with you." She didn't ask. That night, I went back to my apartment and finally cried. Not loud, dramatic sobs. Just quiet tears that soaked into my pillow as I whispered thank yous to people who would never hear them. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for making me feel safe. Thank you for loving me without trying to own me. I didn't know then how temporary that safety really was. The lawyer's office smelled like polished wood and old paper. My parents sat on either side of me, too close, their knees angled inward like bookends. The executor cleared his throat and began reading. There were properties. Accounts. Investments. Personal items. A house I grew up in. Another I didn't even know existed. And then the sentence that changed the air in the room. "Everything," he said, "has been left to you." The silence afterward was loud. I felt my mother stiffen beside me. My father laughed once, short, disbelieving. "That can't be right," he said. "We're her parents." The executor adjusted his glasses. "The will is very clear." I didn't look at them. I stared straight ahead, heart pounding, as realization slowly crept in. They hadn't just loved me. They had protected me, right up until the end. My mother recovered first. She reached for my hand, squeezing it with sudden warmth. Well, she said sweetly, that makes sense. You're young. You'll need guidance. Guidance. I knew that word. It meant obedience dressed up as care. On the drive home, they talked as if decisions had already been made. Selling properties. Consolidating accounts. Managing things properly, my father said. Until you're ready. I watched the city blur past the window and felt something shift inside me, not fear, not grief. Clarity. They thought I would obey. They were confident. Certain. They had no idea what my aunt and uncle had actually left me. If this story is already pulling you in, don't forget to like the video, it helps more than you think. And tell me, what would you do if everyone suddenly expected you to hand your life over? I didn't move back in with them right away. That alone offended them. My mother framed it as concern. My father framed it as logic. But underneath both was the same message: you're delaying the inevitable. They started calling every morning. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to ask if I'd slept. But to remind me, subtly at first, of everything I now had to handle. You don't want to make mistakes with this kind of money, my father said one morning, stirring his coffee loudly enough for me to hear through the phone. People your age get taken advantage of. People my age. I was 27. A full-time professional. Living alone. Paying my own bills since I was 19. But suddenly, inheritance had turned me into a child again. They insisted on weekly dinners. Not invitations, expectations. My mother cooked all my favorite meals, the ones she never made when I was growing up. She laughed more. Touched my arm when she spoke. Acted like warmth was something she'd just discovered. At the table, the conversations always drifted the same way. So, she'd say lightly, we spoke to a financial advisor. We. My father nodded. Just preliminary. Of course everything would go through us for now. For now. I asked once. They exchanged a look. Until you're settled, my mother said. Until things calm down. Things never calm down when control is involved. It just gets quieter. I started noticing how often they used the word family. Family wouldn't let you struggle. Family knows what's best. Family doesn't keep secrets. That last one landed heavier than the rest. One evening, after dessert, my father slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside were printed spreadsheets. Asset breakdowns. Notes in his handwriting. I took the liberty of organizing everything, he said. You'll feel better once it's structured. I closed the folder slowly. I didn't ask you to, I said. The room tightened. My mother's smile flickered. Don't be ungrateful. Ungrateful. That word again, another leash disguised as love. That night, back in my apartment, I opened the safe my aunt had insisted I buy years ago. Inside was a sealed envelope I'd never opened. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate. For when they start pushing. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter. Long, detailed. Calm. She wrote about love, but not the kind that demands obedience. She wrote about patterns, how some people only show up when there's something to gain. She wrote about my parents. Not with anger. With precision. And at the end, one sentence circled twice in blue ink. They will try to convince you that resistance is betrayal. I sat on the floor for a long time after that. Breathing. Listening to my heartbeat. Feeling something unfamiliar bloom in my chest. Resolve. From that moment on, I stopped answering every call. I delayed dinners. I asked questions. I said no, softly at first. And every time I did, their patience thinned. If you're still with me, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next was the moment everything turned. And tell me in the comments, have you ever seen love turn conditional overnight? The first time I said no without softening it, the room went silent. We were in my parents' living room, same couch, same framed family photos that skipped entire years of my life like they'd never happened. My father had just finished explaining, in that patient voice he used when he thought he was being reasonable, that it was time for me to sign a limited power of attorney. Just temporary, he said. Standard procedure. I didn't reach for the papers. No, I said. Not I'll think about it. Not maybe later. Just no. My mother laughed, sharp and quick, like she'd misheard me on purpose. Don't be dramatic. I'm not, I said. My voice surprised even me, steady, unshaking. I'm just not signing anything. The air shifted. My father leaned back, studying me like a problem that refused to solve itself. You're being emotional, he said. Grief does that. Grief. They loved using that word. It made everything I said sound unreliable. This isn't grief, I replied. This is a boundary. My mother's smile disappeared completely. Boundaries are for people who don't trust their family. There it was. The line. Cross it, and you're obedient. Refuse, and you're ungrateful. I stood up, picked up my coat, and walked toward the door. My hands were shaking now, but I didn't stop. Behind me, my father's voice hardened. If you walk out, don't expect us to keep helping you. I turned around slowly. Helping me with what? I asked. They had no answer. That was the moment they realized something had changed. The calls stopped for 3 days. Not because they were giving me space, but because silence is another form of pressure. I knew that trick too. Let the absence do the talking. Let guilt fill the gaps. On the 4th day, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. She looked small standing in my doorway. Hurt. Concerned. The performance was flawless. I'm worried about you, she said. You're isolating yourself. I stepped aside and let her in. I wanted to see how far she'd go. She walked through my apartment slowly, eyes lingering on everything. The furniture. The art. The view. This was the first time she'd really looked, not as my mother, but as someone assessing value. She sat at my table and folded her hands. We've done a lot for you, she said softly. All we ask is transparency. Transparency, I echoed. Yes. No more secrets. I thought of the envelope in my safe. The letter. The preparation. I don't have secrets, I said. I have privacy. Her jaw tightened. You wouldn't have anything if it weren't for family, she said. I leaned forward. You're right, I said quietly. Just not the family you mean. That's when she stood up. Her voice dropped the softness completely. You're making a mistake. No, I said. I'm making a choice. She left without saying goodbye. That night, my phone lit up with messages, from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Concerned. Confused. Asking why I was shutting my parents out. The narrative had already started. If you're feeling this shift with me, hit like. You're going to want to stay for what comes next, because this is where they stopped asking and started taking. They didn't confront me right away. That was the first sign they were changing tactics. For a while, everything went quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that brings peace. This silence felt organized. Strategic. Like people stepping back not because they're done, but because they're preparing something larger. I kept going to work. Kept waking up early. Kept pretending my life hadn't just become a battleground. But I felt it everywhere. At night, I replayed conversations in my head, picking apart every word they'd used. Family. Guidance. Transparency. All innocent words, all sharpened into tools. I understood now that they were never trying to help me manage the inheritance. They were trying to manage me. A week later, the letter arrived. Not an email. Not a call. A letter, formal, official-looking, thick paper with my parents' return address in the corner. Inside was a proposal. They wanted to establish a family trust. They would be the trustees. I would be the beneficiary. It was written in careful language, polished by someone who knew exactly how to make control sound like protection. I sat at my kitchen table reading it 3 times. What struck me wasn't the audacity. It was the assumption. They never asked if I agreed. They never framed it as a discussion. It was already written as if my consent was guaranteed. That night, I opened my aunt's letter again. This time, I read it slowly, out loud, like she was sitting across from me. She had predicted this moment with unsettling accuracy. When they realize affection won't work, she wrote, they will reach for authority. Authority. The next day, I hired my own attorney. Not the one they recommended. Not the one they already spoke to. Mine. A woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice who didn't interrupt me once while I explained everything. When I finished, she didn't look shocked or sympathetic. She nodded. This isn't about money, she said. This is about power. Hearing someone else say it grounded me in a way I didn't know I needed. We went through everything together, the will, the assets, the clauses my aunt and uncle had quietly added to protect me. Safeguards. Restrictions. Clear instructions that excluded my parents completely. They hadn't just left me everything. They had intentionally left my parents nothing. When my attorney looked up at me, her expression softened. They were very intentional, she said. They knew exactly who they were protecting you from. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks. 2 days later, my father called. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Calm. Controlled. We need to talk, he said. You're being influenced by people who don't understand family dynamics. Influenced. As if my thoughts weren't my own. When I still didn't respond, my mother tried a different approach. Her message was longer. Emotional. She talked about her health. About stress. About how all of this was breaking her heart. I listened without responding. Then came the final escalation. They showed up, together, at my job. I saw them through the glass walls of the lobby before they saw me. My mother's posture was rigid. My father was already speaking to the receptionist, his voice low but firm, the way he spoke when he expected doors to open. Something cold settled in my stomach. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about intimidation. I stepped out before security could get involved. We're not doing this here, I said quietly. My father smiled, tight, practiced. Then you shouldn't force us. Force. I felt eyes on us now. Co-workers pretending not to look. Curiosity buzzing in the air. This ends today, I said. You don't come here again. My mother's eyes filled instantly. Look at how you're treating us, she said loudly. After everything we've done. That was the moment I understood. They didn't care if they embarrassed me. They didn't care if they crossed lines. They only cared about winning. If you don't leave, I said evenly, I'll call security. My father stared at me, truly stared this time, like he was seeing someone unfamiliar wearing my face. You wouldn't, he said. I picked up my phone. They left. But not before my mother leaned in close enough for only me to hear. You think you've won, she whispered. But this isn't over. She was right. It wasn't over. If this part is hitting close to home, take a second to like the video. Stories like this don't get pushed unless people engage. And tell me, what's the farthest you've ever seen someone go when they realized they were losing control? After they showed up at my job, I stopped pretending this was still about misunderstandings. That illusion died the moment my mother whispered that threat into my ear, soft enough to sound maternal, sharp enough to cut. From that point on, I knew something important. They were no longer trying to convince me. They were preparing to outmaneuver me. The first move came quietly. I found out through my bank, not from them. A routine notification popped up on my phone while I was standing in line for coffee. An attempted inquiry. Not a transaction. Just someone trying to verify authority on one of my accounts. My hands went cold. I called immediately. The representative hesitated before answering, choosing words carefully. Someone identifying themselves as your parent attempted to access information. They were denied. Denied. That word hit like a small victory, and a warning. They were testing doors. That afternoon, I met with my attorney again. When I told her what happened, she didn't look surprised. She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. This is the phase where they try to scare you, she said. They'll create confusion. Pressure. Make you feel like something could slip through your fingers at any moment. And if that doesn't work? I asked. She met my eyes. Then they'll try to discredit you. It didn't take long. A cousin I barely spoke to messaged me, asking if I was doing okay mentally. An old family friend commented on one of my photos, something vague about remembering who stood by you before the money. They weren't attacking me directly. They were planting doubt. I realized then that my parents didn't need access to my accounts to feel powerful. They needed something more dangerous, the story. Who looked reasonable? Who looked ungrateful? Who looked unstable? And they were very good at shaping that narrative. One night, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was my father. I won't keep leaving messages, he said calmly. But people are starting to worry about you. People, I repeated. Yes. Family. Friends. They're confused. I'm not, I said. He sighed, as if exhausted by my stubbornness. You're isolating yourself, and it's not healthy. You've shut everyone out since the accident. I set boundaries, I said. There's a difference. He paused. Then, quietly, if this goes any further, we may need to involve professionals. Professionals. Therapists. Evaluators. Courts. The threat wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. My pulse thundered in my ears. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to protect you, he said smoothly. From yourself. After the call ended, I sat in the dark for a long time. That was the moment fear finally arrived, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and logical. These weren't impulsive people. They were patient. Calculated. And they knew exactly how systems worked. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I opened every document my aunt and uncle had ever given me. Old emails. Notes. Legal copies. I realized something I hadn't fully appreciated before. They had anticipated escalation. There were contingencies I hadn't activated yet. Protections layered like quiet fortresses. Instructions that only mattered once someone tried to cross certain lines. They had trusted me to recognize the moment. The next morning, I activated everything. New communication boundaries. Formal cease and desist language. Explicit instructions to institutions. No access. No verification. No gray area. When my attorney confirmed it was done, I felt something unexpected. Relief. 2 days later, my mother called from a blocked number. This time, her voice wasn't sweet. It wasn't soft. "You're humiliating us," she said. "Do you have any idea how this looks?" I thought about the funeral. About how they'd collected sympathy like it belonged to them. "This isn't about how it looks," I said. "It's about how it is." She went silent. Then she laughed, low, bitter. "You think you're untouchable now." "I think I'm informed," I said. Her voice dropped. "Money makes people cruel." "No," I replied. "Reveals them." She hung up. That night, as I lay in bed, I finally admitted the truth to myself. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about survival. Because people who believe they are entitled to you don't stop easily when you say no. And the worst part? They still believed I would eventually break. If you're still here, make sure you're subscribed, because the next part is where they made a move that crossed from manipulation into something far more dangerous. And tell me, have you ever seen someone weaponize concern to regain control? The first knock came at 8:43 a.m. I remember the exact time because I'd just poured coffee, and the steam was still rising when the sound hit the door. Firm, official, practiced. Not the knock of a neighbor. Not the hesitation of someone unsure. This knock expected obedience. I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach drop. 2 people stood in the hallway. A man and a woman. Clipboards. Calm faces. The kind of calm that doesn't belong in personal spaces. "Good morning," the woman said when I cracked the door. "We're here to perform a wellness check." Wellness check. My parents' favorite word, concern, finally had a uniform. I didn't open the door fully. "Who called this in?" "We can't disclose that," the man said gently. "But we received reports that you may be under significant emotional distress following a family loss." Family loss. My hands tightened around the doorframe. My parents had finally done it. They'd taken the narrative they were spreading and turned it into something actionable. "I'm fine," I said. "I'm at work every day. I'm under medical care. I have legal representation." The woman smiled sympathetically. "We just need to ask a few questions." I knew better than to invite them in. I answered carefully. Briefly. Factually. They exchanged glances, scribbled notes, and thanked me for my time. When they left, the hallway felt too quiet, like something poisonous had passed through the air. I locked the door and slid down against it. That was the moment something inside me hardened. This wasn't emotional warfare anymore. This was an attempt to strip me of credibility. I called my attorney immediately. "This is escalation," she said after I explained. "And it's reckless." "Can they do that again?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "Unless we stop it." We moved fast. Formal documentation. Medical statements. Preemptive legal notices. Everything clean. Everything documented. That afternoon, I did something I'd been avoiding. I went to the house. The house my aunt and uncle had raised me in. It had been sitting empty since the funeral. I hadn't been ready. Walking inside felt like stepping into a preserved version of myself, the version they had loved without conditions. The air smelled the same. Lemon cleaner. Old books. Safety. I stood in the living room and finally allowed myself to cry, not from fear this time, but from gratitude. They had seen this coming. Not specifics, but the shape of it. On the desk in my uncle's study, I found another envelope. This one wasn't sealed. Inside was a single page. If they ever try to claim you're unstable, it read, it means they're running out of legitimate options. My throat tightened. That night, I didn't go back to my apartment. I stayed there. 2 days later, my father emailed me from a new address. The tone had changed completely. No warmth. No concern. Just authority. He accused me of elder abuse, emotional neglect. Claimed I was withholding information. Suggested my actions were legally questionable. It was absurd. It was also dangerous. Because lies don't need to be true to cause damage. They just need to be repeated. I forwarded everything to my attorney. This is harassment, she said. And now we respond. Not emotionally. Not defensively. Formally. The cease and desist letter went out the next morning. Clear language. Legal consequences. No room for interpretation. That afternoon, my mother showed up again. Not at my apartment. At the house. I saw her car from the window as I stood in the kitchen. My heart slammed against my ribs. She didn't knock. She tried the door. When it didn't open, she circled the house slowly, peering through windows like she still belonged there. I stepped outside. You need to leave, I said. She turned, startled, then angry. You can't keep me away from my own family, she snapped. This isn't your house, I said evenly. And you've been warned. Her eyes flashed. You think paper can stop blood? I took a step closer. I think consequences can. For a moment, I thought she might hit me. Instead, she smiled. The kind of smile that isn't about joy, but about certainty. You're going to regret this, she said. People like you always do. She left tire marks on the driveway. That night, I slept with the lights on. Not because I thought she'd come back, but because I finally accepted the truth. They didn't see me as a daughter anymore. They saw me as an obstacle. If this story has you holding your breath, hit like. It tells the algorithm this kind of story matters. And tell me, what would you do if your own parents tried to erase your credibility? Fear doesn't disappear all at once. It thins. It loosens its grip slowly, like fingers realizing they're no longer holding anything solid. I noticed it the morning after my mother left tire marks on the driveway. I woke up before sunrise, fully alert, heart calm in a way it hadn't been for weeks. No dread. No panic. Just clarity. They had crossed every line they could think of. Emotional manipulation. Public pressure. Legal intimidation. Institutional interference. And still, I was standing. Which meant the thing they were counting on hadn't happened. I hadn't broken. I made coffee in my aunt's kitchen, standing in the same spot she used to stand every morning, humming quietly, completely unaware she was teaching me what stability looked like. I realized then something important: everything my parents were doing now was fueled by desperation, not power. People in control don't threaten. They don't stalk. They don't send others to check your sanity. They act quietly, because they don't need permission. That understanding shifted the entire board. By midday, my attorney called with an update. My parents had responded to the cease and desist letter, not with an apology, but with denial. They claimed misunderstanding. Concern. Love. Predictable. But they'd made a mistake. They'd responded at all. Which meant they had acknowledged receipt. A legal acknowledgement that they were aware their behavior was unwanted, and continued anyway. That mattered. We documented everything. Times. Dates. Witnesses. Patterns. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was building. That evening, I sat down and wrote a letter of my own. Not to them. To myself. I wrote down every moment they dismissed me as emotional. Every time obedience was framed as gratitude. Every time love came with conditions. I wrote it all until the pages blurred, until the story stopped living only in my head. Because gaslighting loses power once it's recorded. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. My cousin, the one who'd asked if I was okay mentally, called me. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "They told us a lot of things." "Like what?" I asked. She hesitated. "That you were unstable. That lawyers were manipulating you. That you didn't remember things clearly after the accident." I closed my eyes. There it was. The long game. "They asked me to check on you," she continued. "But when I asked questions, the stories didn't line up." "What changed?" I asked. She exhaled. "You sounded sane. Calm. And they sounded angry that I noticed." That call was the crack in the dam. Others followed. An aunt who admitted my mother had asked her to keep an eye on me. A family friend who said my father was furious I wouldn't fall in line. Piece by piece, the narrative they'd built started unraveling, not because I defended myself loudly, but because I stayed consistent. Truth doesn't need volume. It needs time. Then came the message that confirmed everything. An email from my father. Short. No pleasantries. "If you continue this path, don't expect reconciliation." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I smiled. Because reconciliation had never been the goal. Control was. I didn't respond. Instead, I filed restraining orders, harassment documentation, formal boundaries with consequences attached. It wasn't revenge. It was containment. The day the orders were approved, I sat on the porch of the house and felt the air move through the trees. The world didn't end. The sky didn't crack open. Life continued. But something fundamental had shifted. They could no longer show up unannounced. They could no longer contact me indirectly. They could no longer pretend this was mutual conflict. It was officially one-sided. That night, I slept in complete darkness for the first time in weeks. No lights. No noise. Just peace. And in that quiet, one final truth settled in my chest. The inheritance wasn't the power. Freedom was. If you're still here, subscribe, because the next part is where the consequences land, and the truth finally reaches them in a way they can't twist. And tell me, have you ever watched someone lose control and call it betrayal? Control doesn't vanish quietly. It lashes out first. The restraining orders didn't make my parents reflect. They made them furious. I didn't hear it directly, because legally, they couldn't contact me, but anger has a way of leaking through other people. A former neighbor called me, confused. A distant relative texted, frantic. Someone from my childhood church emailed, asking what was really going on. They were scrambling. Because once authority is challenged formally, abusers don't look wrong, they look exposed. Then came the mistake that changed everything. My father showed up at the house. He didn't come to the door. He stayed in his car across the street, engine idling, watching. I noticed him only because the same vehicle had been parked there too long, the silhouette too familiar. I didn't confront him. I documented. Photos. Time stamps. A call to my attorney. Then I waited. 30 minutes later, he drove off. 2 days after that, my attorney called. They violated the order, she said. Even indirect surveillance counts. The consequences moved faster than I expected. A court notice. Mandatory mediation, without me present. A formal warning on record. That's when the masks slipped publicly. My mother called my cousins screaming that I had turned the system against them. My father accused me of trying to destroy the family name. They weren't worried about me anymore. They were worried about reputation. And reputation is where truth hurts the most. The final blow came from a place they never anticipated. The will. During a routine review, my attorney noticed something my parents had clearly never read carefully. A clause my aunt and uncle had included, quietly, deliberately. If any party attempted to challenge my competence, my ownership, or my autonomy through legal or institutional means, they would be permanently barred from any indirect benefit tied to the estate. Not just money. Information. Access. Influence. They hadn't just lost control. They had disqualified themselves forever. When my parents were notified, they didn't respond with lawyers. They responded with silence. Real silence this time. Weeks passed. No sightings. No messages through others. No pressure. The war ended not with an apology, but with retreat. One afternoon, as I sorted through boxes in the house, I found an old video recording. My uncle had labeled it simply, "For later." I watched it alone. He spoke calmly, kindly, straight into the camera. "If you're seeing this," he said, "it means we're gone, and someone is trying to make you smaller than you are." My chest tightened. "You don't owe obedience to people who confuse control with love," he continued. "What we left you isn't a gift. It's a shield." I cried then. Fully. Freely. Not from pain. From recognition. They had never doubted me. Now, neither did I. If this part resonated, take a second to like the video. It helps these stories reach people who need them. And tell me, have you ever seen someone collapse the moment their authority was exposed? The silence lasted long enough to feel unreal. At first, I waited for it to break. I kept expecting another escalation, another tactic, another attempt to reach around the boundaries I'd built. When you've lived inside conflict long enough, peace feels suspicious, like the quiet before something worse. But days passed. Then weeks. And nothing happened. No calls through relatives. No cars lingering outside. No, concerned, messages disguised as love. They were gone. Not because they understood. Not because they were sorry. But because they had finally run out of angles. That realization brought a strange grief with it, not the grief of losing parents, but the grief of accepting that I never really had them in the way people mean when they say the word. I mourned the idea of them. The version I kept hoping would show up. And once I let that go, something inside me finally unclenched. I began settling into the house properly. Not like a visitor. Not like someone hiding. But like someone who belonged. I repainted the walls. Opened windows that had stayed closed for years. Let light touch corners that had been left untouched. I stopped flinching at unexpected sounds. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. I started living forward. One afternoon, while organizing old files, I found a folder marked Education. Inside were receipts. Tuition payments. Notes in my aunt's handwriting tracking every semester, every book, every opportunity they'd quietly invested in. They hadn't just left me assets. They had funded my independence long before I knew I'd need it. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and finally understood something that had been circling my mind for months. My parents didn't lose control when the will was read. They lost it when I realized I never needed their permission to exist fully. Control only works when you believe someone else owns your choices. They had mistaken proximity for power. Biology for entitlement. Fear for loyalty. And when those illusions collapsed, there was nothing left to stand on. I heard later, through people who didn't realize how carefully I listened, that my parents were telling a different story now. Not one of concern, not one of betrayal. One of victimhood. They said I had turned cold. That money had changed me. That I'd been influenced against family. I didn't correct them. Because the people who mattered already knew the truth. And the ones who didn't were never really listening anyway. The final moment came quietly. A letter arrived, not from them, but from their attorney. A formal acknowledgement of boundaries. A confirmation that no further contact would be attempted. No apology. Just surrender. I folded the letter and placed it in the safe beside my aunt's first envelope. Not as a trophy, but as proof. Proof that cycles can end. That patterns can break. That inheritance doesn't have to be a curse. Sometimes, it's a line of protection drawn by people who loved you enough to see what you couldn't yet. On the porch that evening, I watched the sun set behind the trees, the sky burning gold and violet. I felt whole, not triumphant, not bitter. Free. And I thought about the sentence my mother whispered months ago. You think you've won. She was wrong. This was never a game. It was my life. If you stayed with me through this entire journey, make sure you're subscribed. Stories like this exist because people recognize themselves in them. And tell me, what did you inherit from your family? Strength, silence, or something you had to unlearn? I used to think inheritance was about what gets transferred after death. Money. Property. Documents sealed in envelopes. I was wrong. Inheritance is what survives despite death. In the weeks after everything ended, after the silence became permanent, I started noticing the smallest changes in myself. Not dramatic ones. Subtle shifts. The kind that only become visible when you're no longer bracing for impact. I spoke more slowly. I slept without locking every thought in place. I laughed, real laughter, the kind that doesn't check the room first. For the first time, my nervous system wasn't waiting for permission. I kept the house mostly the same. Not out of grief, but out of respect. This was the place where no one had ever tried to own me. Where love had been steady, boring, reliable. Where no one demanded proof of loyalty. One afternoon, while cleaning out the last unopened drawer in my uncle's desk, I found a notebook. Not legal. Not financial. Personal. Inside were observations about me, written over years. She doesn't flinch anymore when she speaks her mind. She's learning when silence is power. She'll need to know one day that choosing herself doesn't make her cruel. I pressed the notebook to my chest and sat there for a long time. My parents had thought obedience was my default setting. They were wrong. What they never understood, what they were never supposed to understand, was that the people who raised me didn't just teach me how to survive. They taught me how to see. See manipulation before it hardens into control. See guilt before it dresses itself up as duty. See fear for what it is, a signal, not a command. That was the real inheritance. Not the accounts. Not the houses. Clarity. Months later, I ran into my mother by accident at a grocery store across town. She looked older. Smaller. She saw me, and for a brief second, her face softened, like she might step forward. Then she didn't. Neither did I. There was no anger. No urge to explain. Just distance. And distance, I've learned, is sometimes the healthiest legacy you can leave behind. I walked out into the sunlight with my groceries, my life intact, my choices untouched. They had expected obedience. They had counted on fear. What they never planned for was this. A woman who understood that love without respect is not love at all. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, like, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And tell me in the comments, What would you have done differently, or exactly the same?